In the spring of 1978, Clara May Bell stood at the back of the Millstone County Courthouse with her hands wrapped around a brown envelope, listening to an auctioneer describe 20 acres of land like he was reading its obituary. "Parcel 14, he said. 20 acres, former apple orchard, no current production, no irrigation, sold as is." A few men chuckled before he'd even finished. Everyone in town knew that orchard gray, twisted trees past the old stone bridge, brush swallowing the lower branches, wild grapevines hanging between trunks like ropes in an abandoned barn. People called it the dead orchard. Kids dared each other to run through it after dark. "Opening bid is $800, the clerk said. No one moved. A man near the aisle laughed. "You'd have to pay me $800 to haul those trees off." Clara raised her hand. The laughter stopped just long enough for heads to turn. Harold Pike, who farmed the pasture next door, leaned back and grinned. "Clara, you know that ain't an orchard anymore. That's firewood standing upright," someone added. Clara didn't sit down. No one else bid. The gavel came down. Sold to a 27-year-old woman who'd just spent nearly every dollar her grandmother Ruth had left her in a coffee tin under the sink. By sunset, Clara stood alone among the dead trees, the courthouse laughter replaced by wind dragging through dry branches. From the road it had looked simple. From inside, it was a maze of thorn and shadow trees leaning so far their limbs touched the ground, bark peeling off in strips. Anyone reasonable would have called it exactly what the town called it: a waste, a mistake. Clara pulled a folded cloth bundle from her coat. Inside was a hand-drawn map, yellowed and creased, in her grandmother's careful pencil. Every row marked. Beside the line nearest the stone wall, Ruth had written 3 words: Bell Sweeting Row. Below that, smaller: "Don't judge an old tree by a dead branch." Clara stood there a long moment. "All right, Grandma," she whispered. "Show me." By the following Saturday, Harold was already telling the story at the feed store. "Paid $800 for trees that haven't fruited since Nixon was president," he said to laughs. Clara, meanwhile, was on her knees in wet leaves with a pruning saw, cutting blackberry canes thick enough to crawl under. She cleared brush. She burned vines. She found old irrigation trenches buried under years of mud. By week 3, her knuckles were cracked open, and Harold had taken to slowing his truck just to shake his head as he passed. The county extension agent, Mr. Dobbins, came out one cold February afternoon. He pressed his thumb into a split trunk and gave her the same verdict everyone else had. "These trees are too far gone. An orchard this neglected doesn't come back just because someone wants it to." "My grandmother thought different," Clara said. "Ruth Bell knew trees," he admitted. "But knowing trees and bringing this place back are 2 different things." Clara looked past him at the broken rows. "Maybe," she said, and went back to work. She wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. She was trying to find out what was true. Through March, she learned the orchard's language, which branches were truly dead and which only looked it, where a thin green line still ran under gray bark, what moss on the north side meant versus a split near the graft line. At night she read Ruth's notebook by lamplight. How to find living cambium. How to graft old wood onto young rootstock. One line she read so often the page softened under her thumb: "An old orchard dies from the top down, but hope starts at the root." When a March storm dropped 7 trees in one night, Harold drove by and rolled down his window. "Still think they're alive?" Clara knelt by a fallen limb and wiped mud from a rusted metal tag still nailed into the wood, BS 1941. "It means somebody's work is still in this ground," she said. Harold scoffed and drove off, but that night, Clara found the matching entry in Ruth's notebook, Spring 1941. Bell Sweeting grafts set along stone wall. Late bloom, strong keeper, sweet after frost. She remembered suddenly her grandmother once saying there used to be an apple so sweet after the first frost that people wrapped it in newspaper to save for Christmas. What happened to them? Young Clara had asked. Ruth had only looked out the window. People stopped keeping what didn't make money fast. Now Clara understood. This wasn't 20 acres of dead trees. It was a memory the whole town had let go of, and maybe, if Ruth's notes were right, it wasn't gone yet. She spent what little money she had on grafting tape, pruning oil, and rootstock. By late April, she'd grafted 3 dozen pieces of surviving wood behind her shed and checked them every morning. Nothing. For 2 weeks. Then, on the 7th graft in the 2nd row, a green bud no bigger than a match head. She didn't run to town. She sat down on an overturned bucket and put both hands over her mouth. At Darnell's, men started calling it Clara's kindling farm. Even Mrs. Leahy, who'd known Ruth as a young woman, stopped Clara outside the post office. "Your grandmother loved that place," she said gently. "But love doesn't always bring things back." "No," Clara said, "but sometimes it teaches you where to look." Leahy's face changed. "Ruth used to bring apples to church suppers in a blue basket. I never tasted anything like them." Belle Sweeting? She hadn't heard the name in 30 years. The first blossom opened on April 28th, on the same dark limb Clara had nearly cut off in February. By the end of the week, the whole stone wall row had turned white, and people were pulling over on the road just to stare. Harold came by that Thursday. "You spraying something on those trees?" "No, how then?" "They weren't dead at the roots," Clara said. He didn't apologize. Not yet. Then the frost warning came, a hard drop expected after midnight, cold enough to blacken every blossom on the row. Clara spent the evening dragging quilts, burlap, and borrowed smudge pots tree to tree, knowing full well that one person couldn't save 20 acres alone. Headlights appeared on the road. One truck, then another, then 5. Mrs. Leahy climbed out first with lanterns and bedsheets. Behind her came the county agent with canvas tarps, then the butcher, the postman, a deacon and his sons, and finally Harold, walking through the gate with burlap under his arm. "Which trees matter most?" Leahy asked. Harold answered before Clara could. "All of them, I expect." They worked through the night hanging sheets, lighting smudge pots, carrying warm water in buckets. Near 2 in the morning, holding a lantern while Clara tied burlap around the oldest tree, Harold finally said, "I was wrong about this place." "I was wrong about you too," Clara only nodded. "Some apologies don't fix anything right away. They're just seeds, and seeds don't look like much the night they're planted." By sunrise, the orchard was silver with frost, and no one knew yet what had survived. Clara untied the first sheet. The blossoms underneath were bruised at the edges, but not black. Leahy began to cry, then laugh. Harold took off his hat. Nobody had asked him to. That summer, Clara thinned the new fruit by hand, watered through dry spells, mended fences, kept Ruth's map folded in her back pocket until the creases tore. By August, the apples had turned gold with a faint red blush, lopsided, russet-patched, small enough to vanish in her palm, and nothing like grocery store apples. When Leahy cut the first one open, the smell honey, cider, something old and bright stopped everyone standing there. At the county fair that October, Clara set a blue basket of Belle Sweetings beside Ruth's map under glass. Mrs. Leahy brought an old photograph, young Ruth Bell in 1942, standing by that same stone wall, hand resting on a young tree. On the back, in pencil, Ruth with Belle Sweeting graphs. First bloom. Harold came by just before closing, picked up an apple, and took a bite. For once he had nothing quick to say. "Your grandmother knew what she was doing," he finally said. "Yes," Clara answered. "She did." The next spring, the town put up a wooden sign at the gate, "Ruth Bell Heritage Orchard." Clara hadn't asked for it, but she let it stand not for her own sake, but because Ruth deserved to be remembered in the place where her work had quietly survived. Years later, a little girl visiting on a school trip asked Clara why people had ever thought the orchard was dead. Clara looked toward the road, where Harold and the others had once stood laughing, because they only looked at the branches, she said. They never asked what was still alive underneath. She handed the girl a fallen blossom and showed her how to press it between 2 pages of a notebook the way Ruth had once shown her. A thing isn't dead just because people stop looking for life in it. Sometimes the roots are still there, waiting for one patient person to believe long enough for spring to come.